Gettysburg was geographically almost in the middle between William Oates' home in Alabama and Lawrence Chamberlain's home in Maine. They likely never met in battle before or after Gettysburg, but they were fated to face off at that historic spot, each surviving the war and becoming governor of their states later in life. This is their story. The cold winds of Maine swept through the pines as young Joshua Chamberlain stood at the edge of the orchard, his breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. Even as a child, he had always felt a pull towards something greater than himself, though he could not yet name it. His father, a stern but loving man, had instilled in him the values of discipline and duty. His mother, with her gentle voice and hymns sung by the fireside, cultivated his love for learning and faith. Life in Brewer, Maine was simple but demanding. There was work to be done on the farm, but Joshua always found time to read Greek, Latin, philosophy, books that opened his mind to worlds far beyond the rocky soil of New England. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the south, in the red clay hills of Alabama, William Oates was growing up in a very different world. The Oates family farm was modest, and life in Pike County was hard. William's father expected his sons to work from dawn till dusk, plowing fields under the relentless southern sun. But William was restless. He had little patience for school, and even less for authority. By the time he was 17, a violent altercation with a neighbor left him believing he had killed the man. Fearing arrest and retribution, William fled Alabama and began wandering through Louisiana and eventually Texas. Joshua Chamberlain's journey took him down a more traditional path. He excelled at Bowdoin College, where his natural curiosity and work ethic earned him respect among professors and peers alike. He studied ancient languages with an almost religious fervor and dreamed of becoming a minister or professor. When he graduated, he stayed on at Bowdoin as an instructor and later as a professor of rhetoric. But even as he lectured on Cicero and Plato in the quiet halls of academia, he felt an unease stirring within him, a sense that he was meant for something more. William Oates' education came not from books, but from life on the frontier. In Texas, he worked odd jobs and learned how to survive by his wits alone. He grew tougher with each passing year, a scrappy fighter who refused to back down from any challenge. After several years, his younger brother John tracked him down and brought news that the man he thought he had killed was alive. Relieved and determined to rebuild his life, Oates returned to Alabama with a newfound sense of purpose. He studied law, passed the bar exam in 1858, and opened a small practice in Abbeville. Though he lacked formal schooling beyond this, Oates possessed a sharp mind and relentless determination that would serve him well in the years to come. By 1860, both men were settled into their respective lives, Chamberlain as a respected academic in Maine and Oates as an up-and-coming lawyer in Alabama. Their worlds could not have been more different, one steeped in the intellectual traditions of New England, the other forged in the rugged individualism of the South. Yet both men were shaped by their environments into leaders, men who would rise to meet challenges far beyond anything they could have imagined. As tensions between North and South began to boil over into open conflict, Joshua Chamberlain found himself increasingly torn between his scholarly pursuits and his growing sense of duty to his country. He read President Lincoln's call for volunteers with a heavy heart, but knew what he must do. Against the wishes of Bowdoin's administration, and despite having no prior military experience, he wrote to Maine's governor offering his services. In Alabama, William Oates felt no such hesitation. When war broke out in 1861, he quickly organized a volunteer company known as the Henry Pioneers and joined the Confederate Army. For Oates, this was not just about defending his home state. It was about proving himself as a man, a leader who could command respect on the battlefield. Though they did not know it yet, these two men, one from the rocky coast of Maine, the other from the rolling hills of Alabama, were on a collision course that would change their lives forever. Their journeys had begun on opposite ends of America's Great Divide, but destiny would bring them together on one fateful day in July 1863 at a place called Gettysburg. The summer sun beat down on the training grounds in Brunswick, Maine, as Joshua Chamberlain stood among the ranks of the 20th Maine Volunteer Infantry. The smell of trampled grass mingled with the tang of sweat and gunpowder as the men drilled endlessly, preparing for a war that none of them fully understood. Chamberlain, now a lieutenant colonel, had traded his professor's lectern for a soldier's uniform. He was no longer lecturing on ancient battles, he was preparing to fight in one. Though he had no formal military training, Chamberlain threw himself into learning the art of war with the same intensity he had once devoted to studying Greek philosophy. He read every manual he could find, studied battlefield maps late into the night, and listened intently to seasoned officers. His men respected him, not because he was a natural soldier, but because he was a natural leader, calm under pressure, thoughtful in his decisions, and deeply committed to their welfare. Hundreds of miles away, William Oates was undergoing his own transformation. Unlike Chamberlain, Oates had seen violence before, in his tumultuous youth and during his time in Texas. He was no stranger to hardship or danger, and his men admired his grit and determination. His ambition and leadership skills were evident as he was promoted through the ranks and led his men through several major battles, including Cross Keys, Gaines's Mill, and Antietam. The war tested both men in ways they could not have anticipated. Chamberlain's first taste of combat came at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. It was a slaughter. The Union Army charged repeatedly up Marye's Heights, only to be mowed down by Confederate fire. Chamberlain's regiment saw firsthand the horrors of war, the mangled bodies of young men who had marched into battle full of hope and courage, only to be cut down in an instant. Oates's regiment faced its own trials during the early years of the war. At Antietam in September 1862, the bloodiest single day in American history, the 15th Alabama fought fiercely but suffered devastating casualties. Oates himself narrowly escaped death when a bullet grazed his shoulder. He wrote bitterly about the lack of supplies and support for his men. "We were hungry, barefooted, and ragged," he lamented in a letter home. But despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, Oates emerged as a leader who inspired fierce loyalty among his soldiers. Both men were accompanied by brothers who shared their burdens on the battlefield. Thomas Chamberlain served alongside Joshua in the 20th Maine, while John Oates fought under William's command in the 15th Alabama. For Joshua, having Thomas by his side was both a comfort and a source of anxiety. He felt an almost unbearable responsibility for his younger brother's safety. William felt much the same about John, though he rarely expressed it aloud. As 1863 dawned, both Chamberlain and Oates found themselves rising through the ranks, not because they sought glory, but because their actions demanded it. Chamberlain was promoted to colonel after proving himself as a steady and reliable officer during several skirmishes. His quiet confidence earned him respect not only from his men but also from his superiors. Oates's rise was more tempestuous. His fiery temperament sometimes clashed with other officers, but no one could deny his effectiveness on the battlefield. By mid-1863, he had taken command of the entire 15th Alabama Regiment, a position that gave him both pride and an even greater sense of responsibility. But as spring turned to summer, their paths began to converge. Both regiments were called into action as Union and Confederate forces maneuvered toward what would become one of the most pivotal battles of the war, and one of the most defining moments in their lives. The road to Gettysburg was long and arduous for both men. Chamberlain's 20th Maine had marched through the night and arrived southeast of Gettysburg in the morning on July 2, 1863. After a brief rest by the roadside, Chamberlain and his men were ordered to move with Colonel Strong Vincent's brigade toward the southern end of the battlefield. Initially, they were directed to support Union General Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps near the Peach Orchard, where intense fighting was already underway due to Sickles' controversial decision to advance his corps beyond Cemetery Ridge. However, as Confederate forces under General James Longstreet launched their assault in the afternoon, Union Chief Engineer Gouverneur K. Warren discovered that Little Round Top, the critical left flank of the Union line, was undefended. Recognizing the imminent danger, Warren urgently called for reinforcements. Vincent, seizing the initiative, redirected his brigade from its original path toward Little Round Top without waiting for further orders. Racing against time, Vincent led his regiments, including the 20th Maine, up the rocky slopes of Little Round Top. Arriving just minutes before Confederate forces began their assault, Vincent positioned his brigade strategically along the hill's southern slope. The 20th Maine was placed at the extreme left of the Union line, with orders to hold their ground at all costs. Colonel William C. Oates and the 15th Alabama began their assault on Little Round Top by first climbing the steep, rocky slopes of Big Round Top. Exhausted from a 25-mile march in the July heat and deprived of water, Oates's men pushed Union skirmishers, including elements of the 2nd U.S., sharpshooters, off Big Round Top. After a brief rest at the summit, they descended into the valley between Big and Little Round Top, maneuvering to flank the Union left. The clash was immediate and brutal. Oates led his men up the steep, rocky slope with fierce determination. Wave after wave of Confederates charged the Union line, only to be driven back by the stubborn defense of the 20th Maine. The air filled with smoke and the cries of wounded men as both sides fought with desperate intensity. For hours the battle raged on Little Round Top. Chamberlain moved up and down his line, encouraging his men and adjusting their positions as needed. He saw fear in their eyes but also resolve. They knew what was at stake. Oates, too, was in the thick of the fighting, urging his men forward despite mounting casualties. As the 15th Alabama charged up Little Round Top once more, Colonel William Oates caught sight of his younger brother, Lieutenant John Oates, falling behind. Despite the chaos of battle, William's heart clenched with worry. He saw John stumble and collapse against a boulder, clearly wounded. William desperately wanted to go to his brother's aid, but the pressing demands of command kept him moving forward with his men. As the 15th Alabama was forced to retreat under the 20th Maine's fierce counterattack, William cast one last agonized glance at his brother's motionless form. Unable to reach John in the mayhem, days later William learned the heartbreaking news. John had succumbed to his wounds in a Union field hospital. The loss of his brother, whom he had been unable to save, would haunt William for the rest of his life. As the sun began to set, Chamberlain faced a critical moment. His men were running dangerously low on ammunition, and Oates's Alabamians showed no signs of relenting. In a decision that would become legendary, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down the hill. The 20th Maine swept forward with a ferocious yell, catching the exhausted Confederates off guard. Oates watched in disbelief as his lines began to crumble under the unexpected assault. He tried desperately to rally his men, but it was too late. The 15th Alabama broke and retreated, leaving behind their dead and wounded. As night fell over the battlefield, both Chamberlain and Oates grappled with the enormity of what had transpired. Chamberlain's bold gamble had paid off. Little Round Top remained in Union hands, and his actions may have saved the entire left flank of the Army of the Potomac. But the cost had been high, and he mourned for the men he had lost. Oates, meanwhile, was devastated by the defeat and the loss of his brother. As he helped tend to the wounded, he couldn't help but reflect on the skill and courage of his opponent. Who was this Union colonel who had turned certain defeat into victory? In the days that followed, as the Battle of Gettysburg concluded and the armies began their long retreat, both men found their lives irrevocably changed. Chamberlain's fame began to spread throughout the North. He was hailed as the Lion of Little Round Top, a title that would follow him for the rest of his life. Oates, though defeated, had earned respect for his tenacity and leadership in the face of overwhelming odds. As they left Gettysburg behind, both Chamberlain and Oates carried with them memories that would shape their futures. The horror and heroism of that July afternoon, the weight of command, and the profound understanding that their lives had been part of something far greater than themselves. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Gettysburg had changed them both, and through them, it had changed the course of the war and the nation. The war ended in 1865, but for Joshua Chamberlain and William Oates, the battles did not. The fields of Gettysburg faded into memory, but the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. They returned to homes that had been irrevocably changed by the conflict, each man carrying the weight of his experiences and the ghosts of those who had fallen under his command. Joshua Chamberlain returned to Maine a hero. His actions at Gettysburg had earned him the Medal of Honor, and his reputation as a courageous and selfless leader preceded him. But life after war was not easy. Wounded 6 times during the conflict, Chamberlain carried lingering pain from a near-fatal injury he had sustained at Petersburg in 1864. Despite his physical struggles, he threw himself into rebuilding his life and serving his community. In 1867, Chamberlain was elected governor of Maine, a position he held for 4 terms. His leadership during the war translated seamlessly into politics. He was thoughtful, principled, and deeply committed to healing the divisions that had torn the nation apart. He advocated for veterans' rights and education reform, believing that knowledge was the foundation of a strong and united country. Yet even as he worked tirelessly for progress, he often found himself haunted by memories of Little Round Top. He could still hear the cries of his men, still see the faces of those who had fallen. Chamberlain's brother Thomas remained close to him in the years after the war. Their shared experience on the battlefield had forged an unbreakable bond between them. Together, they reminisced about their time in the 20th Maine, though Joshua rarely spoke of Gettysburg in public. It was too personal, too sacred. William Oates returned to Alabama with far less fanfare than Chamberlain received in Maine. The Confederacy's defeat weighed heavily on him, as did the loss of his brother John at Gettysburg. Oates struggled with guilt. Had he pushed his men too hard up that rocky hill? Could he have saved John if he had made different decisions? These questions lingered as he rebuilt his life in Abbeville. But Oates was not one to wallow in despair. Like Chamberlain, he turned to public service to channel his energy and ambition. He resumed his law practice and entered politics, eventually serving in both the Alabama legislature and the U.S. Congress. In 1894, he was elected governor of Alabama. His tenure focused on modernizing the state's economy and infrastructure, though his views on race and Reconstruction reflected the troubling realities of post-war policies within his political party. Oates never forgot Gettysburg or Little Round Top. In later years, he publicly acknowledged Chamberlain's brilliance as a leader during that fateful day. Though they had been enemies on the battlefield, Oates respected Chamberlain's courage and tactical genius. He even proposed erecting a monument on Little Round Top to honor both sides of the conflict, a gesture that underscored his belief that reconciliation was possible even after such a bitterly divisive war. Though separated by geography and ideology, their lives continued to echo one another in surprising ways. Both men were shaped by their experiences at Gettysburg. Chamberlain's victory cemented his legacy as one of the Union's greatest heroes, while Oates's defeat became a defining moment in his life that tempered his ambition with humility. In their later years, both Chamberlain and Oates wrote extensively about their wartime experiences. Chamberlain's memoirs were filled with reflections on duty, sacrifice, and the meaning of courage under fire. He spoke eloquently about how war tested not only men's bodies but also their souls, and how it revealed both humanity's greatest strengths and its darkest weaknesses. Oates's writings were more raw and personal. He wrote with pride about his men's bravery at Little Round Top, but also with sorrow for those who had been lost. He often wondered what might have happened if things had gone differently that day on Little Round Top. Joshua Chamberlain passed away in 1914 at the age of 85, the last Civil War veteran to die from wounds sustained during the conflict. His legacy as a scholar-soldier endured long after his death. Monuments to him stand not only at Gettysburg, but also in Maine, where he is remembered as one of the state's most beloved figures. William Oates died 4 years earlier in 1910 at the age of 75. Though less celebrated than Chamberlain in popular history, he remained a respected figure in Alabama for his service during and after the war. His proposal for a monument on Little Round Top was never realized during his lifetime, but stands as a testament to his belief in reconciliation. The battlefield where they met remained hallowed ground for both men, a place where courage transcended division, and where two leaders from opposite sides found common ground through shared sacrifice. As America moved into a new century, their stories became part of its collective memory, a reminder that even amid war's devastation, there can be moments of humanity and grace.